Yeah, we'll start our program now on illegal commercialization of wildlife. Uh, if you have questions during the program, you can put them in the chat and then we'll try and address them to everyone at the end of the presentations. So we have three people here, myself, Nate Smith, and Ed Newcomer. And we've dedicated the majority of our life to wildlife law enforcement, conservation law enforcement. And we're continuing to do that, at least Ed and I, in our retirement. Nate's not there yet, but I'm sure he'll still be connected when he takes off that uniform. For me, anyway, I worked most of my career with the Special Operations Unit of California Fish and Wildlife. Most people don't know that wildlife officers are peace officers for the state. Um, First. So we can do drunk drivers, drug arrests, domestic, anything like this. But we have this special expertise, which is wildlife. They don't know how dangerous the job is. If you think about it, almost everyone they come in contact with in the field is armed with a gun, knife, gaff, hook, something like that. Wildlife officers hold greater inspection authority than traditional police officers, in a large part due to the fact that wildlife in California belongs to the people of the state, not any one individual. So officers have greater latitude for accessing private property, inspecting vehicles, boats, coolers, backpacks, and all of that, of course, with some level of probable cause. So during my career, I've had my fellow officers pose as my boyfriend, my husband, my colleagues. I had an estranged dad at one point, employees. We ran a fish business, we ran a reptile business, and so much more. But we've also worked individual cases, and really that's how I got my start in some of this undercover work. Um, Back in the day, there weren't very many female wildlife officers, and even fewer, if any, working in the UC capacity. So after making the team, um, I was kind of relegated to paper pushing for the officers. But my boss and a couple of the other operators were on vacation, and we had this salmon poaching selling case to work out of the Nimbus Dam area. And uh, it was my opportunity, right? But the targets were three people. There was a man charged that had been charged with rape. One was a murder suspect, and the third one was a forger. And they would snag salmon and then they'd sell them at a local liquor market and markets throughout the Sacramento area. Nobody thought I could get into them. But I've got to tell you, it was a piece of cake. Because when I got up there, all they wanted to do was help me out. They showed me how they snagged fish, what gear they used, how they weighed the fish, how they sold the fish. And so after that very first day, we were really off and running. And that's how I really got in the door with the team and with undercover work in California. So um, let's see. When you have a team that could be a husband and wife, boyfriend or girlfriend or something like that, that increases the safety of those officers. So you just don't have one officer in and working. So women not only had a role, but they played a really big part in the safety of officers, infiltration of groups, and leadership that hadn't been explored before. And it also shows you this case that I just talked about, that violators of law will violate any law. Drug traffickers, human traffickers, gun runners, they can all be wildlife traffickers too. They run the same routes and they move the same kind of illegal products. So during my career, and this was back in the day, Nate and will tell you a little bit about what's going on now, but we did a lot of bear case investigations where bears were hunted and killed primarily for their gallbladders and sold in some of our bigger cities. Many of you may have known about the bear farming that happens in Vietnam and some of the other Asian countries. And that's where they're held in these really tiny cages, and then they have bile collection port and they're directly into their gallbladders. This was tremendously inhumane and still is practice, but it's also very lucrative. So a bare gallbladder, if you could get it out of the country in California, back in when I was doing it, it went for about $2,000 an ounce in Vietnam. That's just like gold. It was big business. And that's when the department realized what was happening with our wildlife. We went to the legislature, and it was one of the first times that we went for a felony for a wildlife case. And so if you had a certain number of bare gallbladders, we considered that trafficking, and people could go down for felonies in the state of California. And while we were doing that, it was also the same time that they did a legislative study to find out, where wildlife trafficking was in California. And at the time, it was second only to the illegal drug trade. And most people had no idea. So it runs the gambit. Um, we'd worked an awful lot of abalone cases. Abalone is a shellfish fish. It's a monopod. Um, Back in the day, we had abalone fishing, commercial fishing, and sport fishing. Now we don't have any abalone fishing. We had a storefront where we bought and sold abalone, and every single abalone that came in from a commercial harvester was underreported. They would write down that they brought in 1.2 dozen of abalone, and that really meant 12 dozen. But every single dealer that we were dealing with, and not all of them were the pillars of the commercial fishing industry, granted, but every single one of them was underreported. And you can see the ramifications on that. It's not only a tax ramification coming back to the department or to the state taxes, but it's also a management issue. If we're thinking they're only taking a dozen abalone at this point, and they're really taking 12 dozen abalone, you can see how it can affect the populations. We did work some sport to commercial abalone divers, and it was a huge syndicate. So you'd have people that would live in the city, they'd drive to the North Coast, they'd take abalone. It would be a family affair, well, extended family affair, where some good divers would take abalone for the divers that were less good. They'd trade them off under the water in caves. Then they'd drive back to the city. They'd give it to a trafficker who would then take it out into the city and sell it. These people were making six figures, and this was in the 90s. This whole syndicate, it was crazy. They would sell it at casinos, nail salons, and restaurants. So it was just this huge business that most Californians had no idea about. So let's see. And then you just take a look at the logo for Morro Coast Audubon Society that has the peregrine on it. And part of the reason that we were established with that logo was because of people trying to protect the peregrines. It wasn't only DDT, but it was people that were trafficking in falcons. And that business is still alive and well. Just a couple of years ago, we had somebody trying to take some chicks out of one of the peregrine nests in this county. So they can sell it to collectors in Europe, or they can sell it to the Middle East for people that race falcons. It's big, big business. And then let's see, um, a lot of people think that wildlife trafficking happens in other countries, but it happens here. It's significant. In Florida and Texas, just in this past year, the wildlife officers made cases on songbird trafficking. So they were taking songbirds from the US and shipping them into Central America, where they have these contests for birds that sing. And the best bird that sings, they get rewarded or some kind of reward. I don't know if it's a trophy. I've never been to one, but I know that they take a lot of birds out of the wild to try and get down to Central and South America. And then, it's not all for me anyway. I've done an awful lot of work internationally, and the work I do is to help wildlife officers understand some of the techniques of adaptive leadership. But my specific task is making human connections across international borders. We work to build a network to beat the network of illegal wildlife traffickers. The syndicates move freely across porous borders or even through checkpoints. But the government employees have to work up through their systems, across government to another government, down through their system. And by that time, the product is long gone. So we're trying to build this network of people that can communicate across international lines and across continent lines. A lot of the products that are in South America end up in Asia or Africa. And I think you'll probably hear about some plant cases that we had here in California that was also happening in South Africa. So that's my job internationally, is to create these networks of people that can communicate to help with our conservation effort. So that's a little bit about my history, and we could probably tell stories between the three of us all night long. But we're restricted by time, so right now I'm going to switch it to Nate Smith, one of our assistant chiefs for California Fish and Wildlife, and he's over the Special Operations Unit. So Nate, take it away.
All right. So, as retired Chief Foley kind of introduced, she was part of the Special Operations Unit for California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Before we kind of get into the full description of wildlife trafficking, I think we need to give you a little orientation regarding our department. This is a description of all of the ecological zones or civilian staff sections of California Department of Fish and Wildlife, covering areas from the desert all the way up to the north coast, as you can understand, an extreme diversity of, well, biodiversity, from coastal populations to desert species to north coast offshore, as well as inland bear populations. As Nancy spoke with you a little bit, we have a large network of our own native populations that get harvested and sold illegally or commercially on the illegal markets. And I show you this map because basically each one of these boxes or zones has their own species of concern, whether it be significant reptile trafficking from the desert regions or abalone populations from the Northwest. We experience on the global market all of these animals, so we do what we can to try to monitor those. To give you a concept of our agency from the law enforcement division, we have a southern enforcement district, a central enforcement, northern, and marine. But what's not represented here is special operations. And why that matters is special operations, I like to say we're a free agent. What I mean by that is we don't have the obligation to maintain control of a terrestrial zone or a marine zone. We specifically focus on what's being commercialized, whether that be native species from within the state boundaries of California or offshore, or species that are being illegally commercialized and smuggled into or through the state of California as well. To give you a concept of what the Special Operations Unit is, we have our covert officers, which do work undercover to perform buys or try to purchase illegal product to try to make cases, or intense surveillance, where they can spend months, if not weeks, if not months, in the wilderness, watching groups hunting and poaching and fishing and recreating and monitoring them, trailing them in vehicles, following them to end locations to watch purchases be made. We have Wildlife Trafficking Unit, which has since become another version of our Special Operations Unit, but wildlife trafficking focusing on international trade of species of concern as well. We have a Wildlife Forensics Unit, which does genetic analysis of all the different animals and species that we monitor and patrol for. We have a Restricted Species Program, which monitors and provides supervision for exotic or restricted species that are within the state of California, such as at zoos or other rehabilitation centers. We have officers now over the last couple of years designated to work at the ports of entry, simply looking to watch and monitor for wildlife trade. Internet trafficking, we have teams of officers just watching the internet for people selling and trafficking in wildlife or wildlife parts on any number of venues or access programs. We have a canine program as well that works on the detection of wildlife that can either be used within a port of entry or in open areas to go try to locate hidden game that has been poached by illegal actors or bad actors. We have air services and drone operations unit, which provide aerial surveillance of poaching activities as well as other illegal activities within the state of California. And then we have our Delta Bay Enhanced Enforcement Program, or DBEEP is what it's referred to, which is designed to patrol heavily the anadromous waters of the San Francisco Bay Delta. So those range all the way up from Redding down to Fresno, California, monitoring specifically highly trafficked species such as sturgeon and salmon. Obviously, when it comes to sturgeon, we not only care about the age and the meat quality, but the highly trafficked item being the caviar. So we'll watch a lot of organized crime syndicates working with fishermen to purchase sturgeon for the caviar, oftentimes harvesting only the caviar and wasting the fish meat altogether. When we talk about what is the mission of special operations, I show this picture of a rattlesnake I seized that was illegally in trade. We're very diverse. Our goal is to protect the state's biodiversity, which is a very broad term and broad mission, meaning that can be plants, flora, and fauna. It can be everything. We identify at-risk populations and work to monitor them, protect native species from illegal commercialization, prevent naturalization of non-endemic species. Case in point is, as many people are aware of, Florida, which has a lot of non-endemic species that have naturalized incident to the pet trade. So we're working hard in the state of California to try to prevent that from occurring. We always talk about trying to work to be an ally, as Nancy alluded to our partners across the state, as well as other nations and our U.S. Fish and Wildlife partners. And strongly, it's to be the voice for those who don't have them, whether that be a plant or an animal therein. In the last year, to give you a concept, I think we only have 30 officers currently in special operations. We performed 57 search warrants of residences as well as technological search warrants. We conducted 155 covert operations, 192 completed cases, and 410 citations. Why I say this or show you the slide is just to give you an idea of the scale. One officer here conducted 27 international port inspections and 56 domestic port inspections, meaning he visited a port or he visited an airport or the seaport in Long Beach. And of just those minimal visits, 29 of those led to further investigations that had to be done outside the port of entry. To give you a concept of scale, it's a non-stop problem of which we are grossly understaffed. We continually work to try to grow our staff. We continually work to grow our technology, our ability to detect or model or forecast these illegal behaviors so we can use the minimal staff we have appropriately to monitor this illegal trade that comes through and from within and externally to California. We have, in this image, just represents live animal trade. One of the largest or most frequently live animal trade we discover in transit are amphibians and reptiles. Amphibians and reptiles are regularly trafficked because, as many of you would know, they don't take a lot of maintenance in transit. They can go without food for extended periods of time. They can go without water for extended periods of time, which allows them to be transited in any number of illegal containers. No awareness or care for the animal's well-being in transit. So we're working with developing our own canines as well as our partner canine programs to help use canines to detect these hidden animal species in boxes that are not otherwise indicated as wildlife. As Nancy alluded to, we have an inspection authority for any parcel containing fish or wildlife. So we have the ability, once we can confirm it, and inspect it for compliance with state regulations. I'm going to go kind of briefly over some of the exotic pet trade because Ed Newcomer, who will follow me, I'm sure has many slides regarding the international exotic species. But this is something that is occurring very, very, very regularly in the state of California in the last year. We are encountering a significant population of spider monkeys in transit, as well as some of these other species in this photo. It is catastrophic what is occurring. Essentially, what's happening is native populations are being wiped out. They kill the parents and seize the babies, and then the baby spider monkeys are trafficked in any number of vehicles, luggage, on people, hidden compartments on vehicles into the state of California, Texas, or other United States border crossings, and then transited it into the pet trade within the state of California. Another thing that Nancy alluded to was the prevalence of that correlation with narcotics. This trade is very, very heavily correlated, meaning you will often encounter drugs being trafficked at the same time as primates and at the same time as even humans. So it'll be human drugs and wildlife all being trafficked in the same way. Once the traffickers have a network of importation, whether that be for primates, drugs, or humans, they will use it nonstop to pursue whatever financial gain they can use. So we find these to correlate very, very regularly. Another one that we've been seeing a lot in the last year, which is big cats or exotic cats being brought in to the state of California in pet trade. These often end up in social media photos, and they end up with a lot of followers and people interested and thinking how cute it is to possess a cat, being an exotic cat, and it creates a demand that imports a lot of people into this market. And the exotic traders will oftentimes just come trade you out cubs. Because obviously, once that cub gets to be about 200 pounds, it's no longer an optimal pet in your backyard. So frequently what they'll do is they'll come seize the larger animal and trade you out for a younger cub again. So it's a real gross pet trade that is very hard to work, but we constantly have our officers combing internet and following up on complaints and doing what we can to detect these crimes. The exotic pet trade is another one we've encountered very frequently. Recently, there was a large seizure of over 200 birds in the state of California. So military macaws being one of these species in these photos, as well as toucans. Military macaws, endangered species in South America, are being smuggled in the state of California, oftentimes smuggled in duffel bags or again in hidden compartments. Hearing stories from the border agents, just hearing pecking on the door panels from inside the car, and then they cut the panel open and we'll find birds hidden inside the walls or compartments of the vehicle. That's primarily U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Customs and Border Patrol's job to work those border crossings. California, where we really focus, is once it's in the state of California, what can we do to stop it? As Ed will know, we kind of have different roles and lanes of expertise, and our job really is to exercise the state's rights or laws to help prevent these from being traded illegally. Another one that I'm sure he'll go into also is shark fin. The shark fin trade is a global market. There is a ban on shark fin trade generally everywhere, but it still occurs and we still encounter it to this day in parcels being shipped within the state of California, out of the state of California, and trafficked internationally. Just another photos. Again, this is just discovered in an inspection of a ship coming ashore. So it's just proof and evidence that it's not just an international problem. This is state waters where this is occurring, that we're countering it, and they are sold internationally. Ivory trade, similarly so. We don't host the animal primarily that's being targeted for ivory, being elephant or things of that nature. But we have a responsibility to address the demand that occurs. Because if you don't have demand for the market, similarly the drug market, if there isn't people buying methamphetamine, less methamphetamine in theory would be smuggled. It's the same responsibility we have in the state of California to search for ivory in trade. We had a massive case this last year. I want to say it was over 300 pieces in one sale. So we do what we can to continue to contribute to reduce the demand from residents of the state of California or through the state of California. We talked a little briefly about the sturgeon population. In order to get to the age of reproduction, these sturgeons can range in incredible duration, 20, 30, 100, 120, 200 years old, and they are harvested for their caviar, and then the caviar is trafficked on the market. Obviously, That's very disruptive to the population of sturgeon, which is why we do see a significant reduction in population in sturgeon, amongst other issues or contributing factors. So we do what our can with our Delta Bay Enhanced Enforcement Team, as well as our covert officers, to combat this illegal trade in caviar. It's just another photo. You can see the bucket full of caviar there. Again, oftentimes the fish is inconsequential. The meat is of low value to the poacher, and the caviar is specifically sought out, harvested, and then sold on the illegal market. Abalone, as retired Chief Foley was also speaking of, this is a dramatic issue for the state of California. She alluded to the excessive harvesting that was underreported, which created or represented a significant decline in population. Considering that that was also contributed to large populations of sea urchin, declining populations or habitat of kelp forest, which is critical for abalone reproduction and success. Obviously, that also correlates with sea otters, as sea otters often harvest the sea urchin. So it's a great big convoluted web. And any time that it is poached, it represents a significant impact on the abalone populations. Whether that be historically when it was still a recreational species, it's no longer able to be recreationally fished for or harvested, but the illegal market still happens. But what's so interesting about this is actually where we get to, which is Deadlia. Officers on the North Coast were patrolling, as we often do in covert capacities, watching coastlines, watching for people doing evasive behaviors, stuffing things in bags, pulling out on sides of roads. And that led to an officer discovering boxes full of dirt and Deadlia. And at the time, specifically, Deadlia wasn't considered it wasn't illegal to possess or sell. There was no appropriate law. Once those officers continued to investigate and continued and discovered the scale of this problem, local community organizers, NGOs, non-governmental organizations like you all, came together and reported observing significant declines in populations. So that led to our department working much harder than we ever even knew, because we didn't know this was an issue until it was brought to our attention. And this led to international syndicates trafficking Deadlia all across the world. If it wasn't for the cooperation of those NGOs, we really still wouldn't have sufficient legislation. In the very beginning, charges were filed under destruction of property, vandalism, tax evasion, because there was no appropriate law. What it ended up happening is they worked with NGOs and with legislatures to develop regulations that specifically target the illegal trade of Deadlia. It's just proof of our community involvement really leading to us being able to better enforce these declining populations. With that, if there are any questions specific to this, I don't know if you'd like to wait to the end, Nancy, or not, but otherwise I can shift it over to Ed to continue, whatever you would like.
Yeah, let's go right into Ed. That sounded funny, but yeah. Ed, if you could step in, that would be great. And so Nate, you'll just have to stop sharing.
All right. Cool. Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. Also, thank you very much to MCAS in general. I really appreciate the invite to come speak to you tonight. It's a real pleasure. I always like talking to members of the public about what's going on in wildlife law enforcement, because, you know, none of it happens in a vacuum, right? I mean, law enforcement, we can't really do our job without public support, public participation, and most importantly, public interest in, you know, our mission, because we do it for you. We do work for the public. You do pay our paycheck, and we are out there trying to protect public resources, whether it's plants, land, or animals, for the enjoyment of everybody. So I'm happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen in just a second, but I just thought I'd talk to you real briefly about the difference between, you know, you see California Department of Fish and Wildlife here and U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Most of you probably already kind of have a sense of what the difference is, but we're both law enforcement agencies. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a federal law enforcement agency. And of course, California Department of Fish and Wildlife is state. The easiest way in your head to kind of keep this straight is think about what you know from TV. We're like the FBI for wildlife, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife is like the state police for wildlife. And in that role, we have unique strengths and unique weaknesses between the two agencies. And when we come together and we work together the way things are supposed to go, which is how we do it in California, we can really get a lot done. So as a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service special agent, I was based in Los Angeles for 15 of my 20 years, and I was based overseas for 5 of those years. And so right away, that should kind of pique your interest, because as a federal agent, we have nationwide jurisdiction. So we don't, even though we have our field offices in different states and different cities, we don't really care about state borders. We're not limited by that. And same is true for international. We can work overseas if we need to. And this gives us a huge strength that we can bring to bear to benefit the states. So primarily, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agent is focused on enforcing federal wildlife law. So that's going to be Endangered Species Act, a law called the Lacey Act, maybe the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, anything that would protect wildlife at a federal level and has criminal provisions. A U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agent would be involved in investigating any crime, whether it's poaching it or trafficking in that animal. The Lacey Act I mentioned is kind of interesting because the Lacey Act makes it a federal crime to take wildlife in violation of state law and then move it across the state line. Kind of like if you steal a car in LA, the LAPD will chase you. But if you drive that car to Nevada, now the FBI can get involved and help the LAPD track you down. So we play the same role with the states, because although the states are well networked among each other, the jurisdiction of a California Department of Fish and Wildlife game warden ends at the border. So if they have a bad guy that's moving something across state lines or in international commerce, they can do it, but it's not as easy as it is for a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agent who has the ability to cross borders, has other agents in those states that they can just pick up the phone and call, and in many cases has agents based overseas at U.S. embassies. That becomes a great tool. So that's kind of the relationship between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the state. We work really closely together. We often back each other up on things, and sometimes we work on something that has both a state violation and a federal violation, and we just kind of decide together where are we going to get the best bang, and we go either to state court or federal court depending on where we're going to get the best result. So I'm going to share my screen now, and Nancy and Nate kind of set me up for failure here because they just talked about all these things Ed's going to talk about. But in reality, as I was doing this, I thought, I could have you guys here all night talking about all the different types of wildlife trafficking. So I thought, well, this is an Audubon chapter, so I'm going to talk about wildlife trafficking related to birds. But I will touch on some of the things they brought up with regard to the plant case and even ivory. And you know what? I'm going to do ivory right now, because sometimes, sometimes I've had people say, why does the U.S. care about ivory? Why does a state game warden care about ivory? And there's 2 reasons for that. One is the United States is unique. We're one of the only countries in the world where through our Endangered Species Act, we actually protect animals that do not occur here. So elephants are not native to the U.S., but we still protect them under our federal law. But this one, I think, is more important. I once talked to a New York game warden in the state of New York, and he was actually a supervisor of a unit, kind of like Nate, and he was getting pushback from his state legislators about why are our state game wardens spending time in New York City making ivory cases. And his answer was really great. He said, there are African rangers and African game wardens being killed to save these animals, and I'll be damned if the citizens of New York are going to contribute to that. And I was like, that is like the best answer to that question I've ever heard. And I think we do all have a a moral and ethical responsibility to protect these animals and the people around the world that are trying to save them. So anyway, let me share my screen here with you guys, and I got a nice cute bird. So I'm going to focus on, assuming this is working, stand by. Slideshow. There we go. We're going to talk about wildlife trafficking as it impacts birds and humans, which I think is kind of interesting. So we've talked about what is wildlife trafficking, but really, it's the commercialization of protected wildlife. So it's illegal. Just you don't need to say illegal wildlife trafficking, because all wildlife trafficking is illegal. We're going to talk tonight about how birds are trafficked, what are the impacts on birds, and also then importantly, what are the impacts on us, on people, as a result of wildlife trafficking in general, but specifically birds. Just to give you kind of a framework for thinking about this. Prior to maybe 2000, somewhere between 2005 and 2008, wildlife trafficking kind of looked like this. It included Africa, but most of it was coming out of Asia, and it was headed to Western Europe and the United States. We were one of the major consumers of illegal wildlife products in the world. We were the customers. And it was everything from the pet trade, fish, coral, live animals, pelts, ivory, you name it. But right around 2005, 2006, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started to see a change. And what we started to see was wildlife headed out of the United States. So our domestic wildlife, our turtles, tatuabas out of North America, tatuaba fish from the Sea of Cortez, bear gallbladder, all kinds of things were headed to Asia now. And the reason for this was the economies in China and Vietnam were growing, Korea too, and it was creating demand. There was more disposable income and more ability to consume some of these items. Now, shockingly, a lot of the South Asian wildlife, reptiles, bear gall, tiger stuff was also being trafficked around within Asia. So this is a change. We're still a consumer country. We still see wildlife trafficking coming to the US, Western Europe, out of Southeast Asia, Africa, South America. But all of these regions are now seeing wildlife also going to Asia and Southeast Asia. So if I were to put all the lines up here of where wildlife trafficking goes, it would look like I threw a bowl of spaghetti on the world. Literally, wildlife is being trafficked all over the place, from every country you can imagine to every country you can imagine. It's pretty insidious, and it's a big load. Just to give you an idea, I don't think Nate or Nancy mentioned how many game wardens there are in the state of California, but nationwide, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is authorized to have no more than 253 agents, and that has not changed for 40 years. Right now, because of budget insecurities, Fish and Wildlife's down to around 200, I think. So it's a big job to deal with all of this. And when it comes to trafficking in general, but we're going to talk about birds specifically, we're going to talk a little bit of transport methods. We've got live birds, we got dead birds, we got parts. It's all there. I'm just going to run you through a couple of typical cases. This is a horrible picture. This is two live parrots. One of them's a golden conure, actually, and the other one is a pretty common caïque. And these were actually strapped to the body of a person who was trying to smuggle them out of the United States. So we don't know whether they purchased them here in the US or whether they smuggled them up from South America or Central America, but they were trying to get them out to China. And this woman had these strapped to her body. I can't imagine these birds would have survived this trip, 17, 18-hour flight or more. But as you can see, they're very cruelly packaged. They have those little orange things shoved between their beaks. are ear protectors that you might put in, if you're using power tools or something. Really disgusting. This woman was arrested. I arrested her about 11:30 at night, took her to jail, and then I had the problem of I had to feed my evidence. And turns out the little Kaik wasn't even eating whole food by itself yet, so I had to hand feed that, and the golden conure enjoyed grapes while I was doing that. But this is the kind of thing that California state game wardens face, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officers face all the time. We arrest somebody at 11 o'clock at night. We have to process our arrested person, take care of them, but then we have to go to the office, and we're often there all night taking care of live evidence, which can't be just chucked in an evidence room. So that's one transport method on the body. People will put birds on their body. Another method that Nate talked about was they'll hide birds in secret compartments in vehicles or in vehicles. Usually it's under seats or in compartments that are hollowed out. The same compartments that are also used to smuggle drugs. So again, it's very convenient. If you've got a vehicle equipped with secret compartments, you might as well put some birds in. You might as well put some drugs in. These are live parrots that were intercepted at the Mexico border. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, another strength we bring to working with the states is we have full customs authority. So we can search any vehicle, any person, any package, any mail parcel coming or going from the U.S. And so that gives us a lot of authority. We don't need a warrant to do that. As long as it's in international transit, we can open it and look. So this is down at the Mexico border. A lot of parrots stuffed in secret compartments. One of the things that neither Nancy or Nate mentioned, the insidious side of this trade is that because of the cruel conditions these animals are kept in when they're in transit, poachers and traffickers know that you're going to have about somewhere between 30 and 50% mortality rate. So they often smuggle way more animals than they need. So if they have an order for 50 parrots, they know they can sell 50. They'll bring up 100 because they figure probably 50 of them are going to die in transit because of the way they have to handle them. Pretty bad. You can see these birds, they just don't look happy, right? So this is another way that traffickers will transport live birds. Wildlife trafficking can even happen locally. This is a pet store owner up in Sunland who had a live American kestrel for sale in the pet store. So interestingly, this would be a bird protected by the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act, also protected by state law. But one of the interesting things about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the federal law, is that it's a misdemeanor to take or possess a bird protected by the MBTA. However, in this case, this gentleman was selling the kestrel for about $250. If you possess a migratory bird with intent to sell, it's a felony. So we were actually able to make a case against this guy for a felony simply for possessing and selling an American kestrel. So trafficking can happen even to domestic animals at your local pet store in Sunland. Live birds also end up on the internet. This is a Craigslist ad from 2011 showing a blue jay. It was actually a scrub jay that was for sale, but this gives you a sense of how something might be advertised and the price that someone is looking to obtain, $225. I'm sure that was negotiable, but this is a 818 area code. Somebody probably captured this bird in their backyard and is trying to sell it. And the bird that they were selling is not the bird in that photo. It's this bird, which you can see doesn't look too sharp, right? Nate and Nancy both mentioned this, that the conditions that these animals are kept in are often substandard. And particularly with birds, people who catch them and traffic them don't know how to take care of them. So they often suffer from things like bumblefoot or other, they'll have broken legs or broken wings because they're handled roughly, they're packaged roughly, they're hidden, it's not a nice life for these birds. So there's another example of how live birds are sold. Then another transport method, of course, internationally is through cargo. And Nate mentioned the reptiles are often transported this way, but believe it or not, birds are trafficked this way as well. They're harder because they're not as hardy as a reptile, but they typically might come in containers like this that are behind my arms there with the PS on them. And most likely, it's going to be impossible to conceal that you've got a live animal in that box because they're going to have holes in them for air, and they might smell, and a detection dog might pick it up. So what people typically do when they traffic in birds in this way through air cargo, they'll misdeclare. So they'll declare it as something that's not illegal. So they'll have, on first glance, it'll look like all their paperwork is in order. They might even have a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to import or export that particular animal. But once you do a dive on the paperwork, you find out that they may have identified it as captive bred, but it's not. They may have identified it as a species that is not prohibited by CITES or the Endangered Species Act, but in fact, it's a similar looking species and they're trying to launder it. And it takes an educated U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wildlife inspector or a well-educated state game warden or a well-educated special agent who can figure out that's not the bird that's on the paperwork. And these can be very tricky cases to investigate. They can often come down to paperwork. These birds are often, packaged poorly. They often don't survive these trips. Again, if you're going to smuggle, you need to bring about 50% more than you're planning to sell. And then, of course, we have dead birds and dead bird parts, or bird parts are trafficked. Taxidermy mounts, even waterfowl that can be legally hunted. While you can have a taxidermied mount in your house, you couldn't have a taxidermied mount of a hawk because hawks cannot be hunted. But you could have a goose, but you can't sell it. So that's the difference. If you're a hunter and you have a goose or a duck that's been taxidermied after you've hunted it, you can give it to somebody, but you can't sell it. That would be actually a felony under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So these are the kind of things that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agents, state game wardens encounter all the time. Eagle trafficking in eagle parts is still very common. Eagle talons, eagle skulls, eagle feathers, obviously, are very highly valued in certain communities on the powwow circuit. And there's a lot of trafficking that goes on related to those birds as well. So that's kind of the wildlife trafficking primer, how it's done, the different types of birds that are trafficked and how they're trafficked, dead, live. I want to give you a couple of case studies now that I think are really interesting because there is a human health risk related to trafficking in live animals, particularly birds, primates too. It's something that is being talked about more, and I think it needs to be talked about even more than that because wildlife law enforcement agencies, I think, have the potential to play a very important role in protecting human health from the introduction of zoonotic diseases. If there's anything we learned from COVID, it's that. So this is a case that goes back to 2002 to 2005, but as Nate mentioned, there was recently a shipment of live parrots intercepted coming across the border. And during 2002 to 2005, one of our agents in San Diego was working on a bird trafficking case, and she was very closely monitoring the activities of a known bird trafficker, trying to figure out what his network was, where he was delivering birds, where he kept them. And what she found out was that he was located, his main base of operations was right there near Ontario Airport, very urban area of Los Angeles. Now, what she did not know at the time was that, well, I take that back. We all knew at the time that in Southern California, there had been a massive outbreak of a disease called Newcastle's disease. Now, Newcastle's disease can infect human beings, but it primarily impacts the domestic chicken industry, and it can devastate domestic poultry or chicken businesses. So people, farmers have to destroy large quantities of their chicken stock if Newcastle's gets into the population. What Agent Nichols discovered when she was doing this case was that the outbreak of Newcastle's happened to center right here around our suspect's house. That's where the very first cases of Newcastle's appeared, and it spread from there. So in humans, you get flu-like symptoms, but as I said, it devastates the commercial chicken industry. And so there are some chicken farms in this area, and USDA pinpointed the kind of patient zero within a zone right around the house of our parrot trafficker. And parrots do carry Newcastle's disease. So at the end of this case, it was everybody agreed that our parrot trafficker was the origin point of the Newcastle's outbreak during that time in Southern California. And kind of illustrates this is important not just for conservation reasons, but for a lot of other reasons. There are other diseases that birds can carry. Psittacosis can infect humans as well, causes fever, headache, and can lead to pneumonia. And I know you're all just waiting for me to talk about the big disease in the room, which is bird flu. And in 2009, another special agent in Southern California, this one based out of Los Angeles, was investigating information about a suspect who was believed to be smuggling in birds from Vietnam. And if you know anything about bird flu, you know that the most virulent strains of bird flu have been recorded in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam. And it primarily gets its start in wild birds there, but also in domestic birds. So what this case led to was a discovery that the person in Los Angeles area was using mules to bring live songbirds attached to, and by mules, I mean people who smuggled. They would attach live songbirds to their legs and bring the birds in on domestic flights. So these are flights from originating in Vietnam. That means you've got to transit through someplace else on your way to Los Angeles. You're probably on planes and in airports for more than 20 hours. And so imagine this is one individual had 14 live birds strapped to his legs during that entire flight. Completely, if any of these birds had diseases that could be communicated to humans, every single person on that plane would have been potentially exposed. So when we arrested this individual, and I know what you're going to ask, you're going to say, how come nobody heard these birds cheeping? And I'll get to that. When we arrested this individual, we suited up because by 2009, we were aware that bird flu was present in Vietnam. So we took no chances when we were removing these birds from the person we had just arrested. Bird flu, if you don't know, there's different strains of it. This one out of Vietnam, the H5N1, has a 60% mortality rate. Compare that to COVID, which had a 3% mortality rate. So you can only imagine if bird flu gets loose, makes a slight mutation into the human population, and we have a pandemic or epidemic of H5N1, we're going to have 60% mortality rate on our hands. The lowest level, if bird flu, the lowest level recorded out of the strains out of Southeast Asia is 32%, 30%. It's been interesting. The bird flu that has broken out in the US has morphed. It has gone into mammals. I'm sure you're aware it went into dairy cows. And it did lead to some human cases, but those cases don't seem to have as high of a mortality rate, although there have been some deaths from the human infections that have occurred in the United States already. So, but it doesn't appear that right now, the mutations that have made the jump into humans here in the States, they don't appear to have the high mortality rate, but that does not mean it can't happen. Some of these bird flu strains are resistant to antiviral drugs. So this is a super scary thing for me. This is something I've been kind of screaming about since 2013, that we need to be more on the ball when it comes to cracking down on bird trafficking, because this is one place where a virulent strain of avian flu could get introduced into the human population. So I don't mean to scare you, but have a great evening. All right. One of the last things I'll talk about is the internet. I showed you that ad for a scrub jay that was for sale, but a lot of wildlife trafficking happens on the internet. The primate trafficking that Nate talked about is absolutely exploding right now over the internet, and it all is fueled by social media. But birds are no different. And there came a time, 2010 to 12, that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service realized that the internet was really out of control. And we were kind of doing what California Fish and Wildlife was doing. We had agents kind of watching the web, but we were making one-off cases. We weren't really making a dent in the problem. So in 2011 and 12, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, we initiated what was called Operation Wild Web. And the idea behind these operations was to attack wildlife trafficking occurring on the internet. And the idea was we're going to have a lot of people working on this at the same time for a 2-week period, and we're going to hit it really hard. And everybody who gets caught is going to get charged. And then we're going to do a big press release, and we're going to try to draw attention to this problem to try to deter future criminals from engaging in it. So we had 7 teams set up around the country. We were going to attack the internet for the same 2-week period. All the 7 teams committed to doing that. We even had commitment from Thailand, Singapore, and Indonesia to cooperate. They ran their own operations during that 2-week period. And lo and behold, a lot of the cases we made involved birds, not just in the United States, but overseas as well. So including a hornbill in Thailand, native species in Florida there. It was a really cool operation. In just 24 hours, we were out the door making our first what's called a buy bust out in the field. And typically, just to give you a sense, each team, depending on where they were in the country and the world, we were doing about 3 buy busts a day during a 2-week period. And just one team would be doing 2 to 3 a day, which that's a lot for a law enforcement team to be knocking out, because buy busts are kind of inherently dangerous because you're meeting. Basically, what you're doing is you're making a covert deal to go buy that item. And then an undercover officer goes out in the field and meets with the seller. But you don't really know. You don't know who you're going to meet. You don't know how many people are going to show up to that meeting. So we had a lot of officers for cover, but it's pretty stressful to do 3 of those in a day because you're really just moving from one to the other. The point of that is, for all these teams, we confiscated many hundreds of wildlife items in just 2 weeks, live animals, dead animals, animal parts, and a lot of those were birds. And what's the purpose of all that, right? You make all these cases, but what's the purpose? And here's what was cool about that operation. Because all the teams followed the same rules, we held our press releases until the very end. Everybody turned in their results, and every single team around the world did basically the same press release, that this was a global operation, multi-state operation, and we made this many arrests in this short a time and this many animals. And that has the ability to alert people that this is a problem. Legislators, Congress members, but also the public. So it puts people like you, who are law-abiding citizens, on the alert that, hey, an advertisement to sell a blue jay is probably illegal, and maybe I should call California Department of Fish and Wildlife or U.S. Fish and Wildlife and report that. Also, a person who is considering buying a bird might see that in the paper and be like, oh no, I could get arrested for this. And that's what we call deterrence. And Operation Wild Web, an NGO did a little bit of a study on what the results were. And I thought this was just super cool. In just 48 hours after the first press releases went out on Operation Wild Web, there were 335 million individual hits on the internet on the stories. And like 164 million of those were Yahoo News. I think 85 million were MSN News. And the NGO calculated that for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to have done targeted advertising to discourage people from being engaged in online trafficking, we would have had to spend $192,000 to get that same kind of exposure in the public's eye. So, this was great for Fish and Wildlife Service. It was great for California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It was great for every state agency that participated. And it was great for every single one of the foreign countries that participated. it's not just about we got to catch this bad guy. We have to catch that bad guy, but we also have to deter future bad guys from engaging in these crimes. And one of the ways we do that is by doing targeted operations that we intentionally put media pieces out about. It's really important. So what can you do, MCAS members, to help us out? And honestly, I think the most important thing is be aware, be alert. Doesn't mean you have to be a nosy Karen, or Ken, but be aware of what's going on in your surroundings and what you see people doing. It's pretty easy to spot suspicious behavior when you're out in the woods. You know it when you see it. The other thing you can do is kind of follow press releases and the websites and social media sites for California Department of Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Over time, that'll give you a sense on, wow, they seem to be making a lot of monkey cases or a lot of tiger cases or a lot of bird cases. And it'll kind of adjust your thinking to be on the lookout for that stuff. And the next time you see something, you'll be like, wait a second, I just saw a press release about that, and I know that's illegal. So it kind of helps you have a general sense on what's going on, what the hot topics are. The other thing is be a good witness. Don't try to be out there stopping crime yourself. That can be dangerous, but record information, of descriptions of people, descriptions of vehicles, license plates, methods, anything you see that you think is, would help us identify those people, even if you're not even sure something illegal is going on. Write it down, report it. You never know how important that information might be to law enforcement. And then report. That's the other thing you can do is be involved. We can't, I think one of Nate's slides mentioned that, we're trying to be the voice for animals and plants that don't have a voice. Yeah, they can't call 911. They're not calling. So we need people. We need people to be those good witnesses and to report those crimes. It's critical. We can't do it by ourselves. One of my favorite quotes of all time is, "The law without enforcement is only good advice." That quote is attributed to Abraham Lincoln, and it's kind of my motto. If we're not out there enforcing it, then any law on the books is just advice to the bad guys that we don't want you doing that. But we got to have the enforcement behind it. The last thing I'll say, Nancy very graciously offered me an opportunity to plug my podcast. And it actually is very appropriate because a few months ago, I started a podcast called Nature's Secret Service. It's on all the major podcast sites. It's all about wildlife crime. So if you're interested in true crime and about wildlife crime, tune in. You can listen to federal agents and state game wardens tell their stories. I think Nancy promised you I would talk about plants, but guess what? I didn't. However, the episode that is coming out tomorrow will feature a state game warden named Savannah Morgan, who worked on one of those giant Dudleya cases. And Savannah and I, you can listen to us sit down and talk about this unbelievable Dudleya trafficking case she made, where she pretty much caught one of the most notorious Dudleya traffickers in the world, a South Korean national named Byung-Soo Kim. So it's a great episode. I've listened to it a couple times already. It comes out tomorrow. If you want to catch up about Dudleyas, tune in tomorrow. And that's all I have. Thank you, Nancy, and everybody. I appreciate your time, and thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks, Ed, and thanks, Nate. I did put your naturesecretservice.com address in the chat. I also put in the Plant Heist, which was a documentary on Dudleya trafficking. And then I put my email if anybody has any questions that we don't get to today. We can talk about that. And then, just in closing for the three of us, I just want to say there's only about 450, there are about 500 game warden positions in the state of California. There are probably only about 450 officers. We've got 40 million people. We've got one of the most diverse states in the nation. There are only 250 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agents, and honestly, there's probably only 230, something like that. And there's less than 100 inspectors. We cannot do it by ourselves. We need everybody's help. So like those last slides of Ed's, report crime, keep an eye open, let us know what you're hearing. Nate, if you can, I don't know if you can put the CalTIP number in the chat, but we do have texting options and a phone line that you can report crime in California. And so what I want you to know is that everything here, whether it's an animal, fish, plant, bird, or insect, has a dollar value on it. If you expand that to the global market, we can see that it's much more than elephant ivory, rhino horn, and pangolins, which are the most trafficked animal in the world, or bird species. In the last week, there have been major smuggling rings for ants in Kenya and hermit crabs in China. So it's absolutely everywhere. And our wildlife officers, our fish and wildlife agents, we're the ones that protect those things that you care about. And we have to be a team. It can't be, only hunters and fishers support wildlife officers. It has to be the birders, the mountain bikers, the hikers, and the consumptive users, because we all care about the same thing. We all have that common purpose, which is conservation. So thanks, Ed. Thanks, Nate. I didn't see any questions coming through. Let me see right here.
Nancy, I saw one that was directed to me. And it's because I forgot to mention why birds don't cheep when they're being on somebody's body. So and it's actually a funny story on that smuggler from Vietnam who had him strapped to his legs. When they're covered, they're quiet. So when his pant legs were down, they were totally quiet for the whole flight, didn't make a peep. But when the one of the ways we found him, we didn't know his name, but we knew there was a smuggler on that flight. And when he came off, we didn't have a canine at the time who would detect, so we were trying to figure it out. And I saw this guy walking down the jetway, kind of walking like John Wayne, his legs apart, kind of awkward. And I said, well, that's probably our guy. So I kind of followed him out. And when he went to the customs area, I looked down and I saw a tiny little bird poop on his shoe. And I knew we had the right guy. So we handcuffed him and we took him in the back. We suited up. And when we came in, we lifted up the pant legs, and it was like a forest in the morning. As soon as they were exposed to light, they all started cheeping. But it's weird. As long as they were covered, quiet as mice. That's the answer. I'm sorry I didn't give it to you during my presentation.
Sorry, my dogs were barking. Somebody came to the door. But I do see a couple of questions coming in now, and one is from Susie, and it says, "What happens to animals who do survive trafficking and are seized alive, and how often are the buyers arrested?"
So actually, that's something I can talk to. Recently, California, in addition to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, have entered into a contract with AZA, Wildlife Confiscation Network, which the point of the confiscation network is to really help officers be able to stay in the field and do their job. As Ed alluded to, I can't even tell you how many odd phone calls come in from the team. I have two monkeys. What do I do with them? And it's 10 p.m. on a Friday night. It is an absolute struggle for us to find housing and placement for animals immediately, which led to a global effort to create this wildlife confiscation network in combination with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the state of California. We both have individual contracts to support that. And now we rush them to triage accredited AZA facilities, and then they work to find placement through that network or repatriation. It really depends. Some species, based on their conservation value, do need to be considered the possible routes towards repatriation, which is a very complex and convoluted challenge that goes through APHIS and many other challenges that come along. But as a general rule, we work with that wildlife confiscation network now globally with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and California to work on immediate placement of those animals.
And how often are buyers arrested?
I'll talk about that. It really depends. my philosophy was if it was a smuggler, and sometimes people will buy something overseas, they're on vacation and they're not thinking, right? And they don't even know it's illegal and they'll just have it. They'll come off the plane from wherever and they'll have a sea turtle shell. And they're not thinking because it's for sale overseas. They're not thinking that it's protected species. So if they're not hiding it, generally what we would do in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, if we intercepted someone like that, we'd take it from them. We'd seize it and we'd warn them. We'd educate them. If they're hiding it, that's a totally different story, right? Because that implies they know they're not supposed to do this. So if it's hidden, my rule, they get arrested. I arrested them. If they smuggled something into the country or out and it was hidden, they're going to jail. Out in the street, when they're buying and selling, it just kind of depends. Depends on the seriousness of the crime, whether or not you know they have a prior history and what happens during the encounter. That's how the feds do it, to make what's called a probable cause arrest. Generally, if they're involved in a felony and there's no prior criminal history, we might detain, identify, and release, and then subsequently indict them in a grand jury. And then they get charged federally with a felony. And that may or may not lead to an arrest warrant if they self-surrender. That's kind of a complicated answer, but it varies.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions coming in now. One of them was, how can we share this? And we do have a YouTube channel. So it's Morro Coast Audubon Society on YouTube. And so this whole thing is being recorded, so you can share it that way. One question was about genetic analysis, and do you have any advice for getting jobs in the field? They graduated with a master's in wildlife forensic science, yada, yada, yada. Both the state of California and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife have amazing facilities for forensics on wildlife. I mean, world class, both of them, and they work together. So I would suggest looking at both of those options. There's also another one in Idaho. I think it's Idaho and South Africa just opened a big wildlife forensic opportunity. And I think that I don't know about U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but I know that in the past, at least, California Fish and Wildlife had some interns that worked in their forensic labs. And so it's a great way to get your foot in the door.
I don't think we could answer that any better, Nancy. That was spot on. Yes.
Let's see. So there was one. What single species in California requires the largest enforcement effort?
That is a very exceedingly difficult question to answer because I'll just flatly tell you all of them do. Like I alluded to in that early on slide, we're the voice for all that don't have a voice. That's kind of the motto of special operations. And we just focus on, I guess, what's in front of us at that moment. When we have a moment where we discover something that's heavily impacted by illegal trafficking, we put all of our energy into it. And I hate to use the term whack-a-mole, but very much like that. We are ever pivoting and paying attention to populations. So as Ed talked about, what can you do in the public? If you see a population suddenly taking a turn for the worst, let a fish and wildlife officer know, because it may very well be something that's occurring in the trafficking industry. And we'll put all of our energy to bear in trying to discover what that is. It doesn't always end up being wildlife trafficking. It can be any number of issues, but yeah, we are constantly chasing that very question with whatever resources we have available to us with Ed's 200 officers and our 500 officers doing all that we can.
And I'll add to that. I don't think it's incorrect to use the whack-a-mole analogy, and to use it does not imply that we're losing, right? It's a lot of wildlife trafficking is kind of cyclical, and what'll happen a lot of times is we will see, jointly or independently in our agencies, we will see a problem and we'll start to focus resources on it and we'll kind of hit it hard. Like, for example, remember the example I gave of the parrot trafficker up in the Ontario area? So early 2000s, we saw a lot of parrot trafficking, a lot. I mean, it was happening all the time. A lot of our agents were working on it. And we identified kind of the key players and we hit them hard. We arrested them, we charged them, they went to jail, took a lot of their assets. And as a result, parrot trafficking kind of went down for between 2005 and I don't know, 15 probably. It happened, but it wasn't that common. And now it's starting to make a resurgence. And so that happens with all kinds of things. We hit it hard, we tamp it down, and it goes away for a while, and then it kind of comes back. And that's okay because our job is not actually to eliminate wildlife trafficking. That ain't going to happen. If we think that's our job, we're going to have failed careers. Our job is to keep it at a low enough level that the animals can thrive even with the low pressure, right? I mean, people are always going to poach. So we just want to keep the poaching low enough that the wildlife can survive naturally with that pressure. If the pressure gets too high, they can't reproduce fast enough, or whatever. So the whack-a-mole's, it's an okay way to think about it. We're going to whack that hard, and then we're not going to worry about that for a while. We'll focus on something else that's emerging. That's just kind of the game. So, yeah.
So Nate, you have one that came from Wally. Sarah wants to know how she can help with the canine training like she did with Coda and liver treats. I'll let you answer that. He says email me. So you can email Wally.
I will get your email contact and we'll be in touch. The support of the K9 program, as Nancy kind of gave in my intro, is very near and dear to my heart. I was a handler for, I don't know anymore, somewhere around 13 or 14 years. It just became a part of my life. I lived with a dog. They were part of the family. They took care of the kids. It's part of ingrained who I am. So we're very, very passionate about the use of canines in this industry as well for California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So thank you for the comment, and we'll be in touch.
One other one is, do you care about old taxidermy mounts of tigers and such that have been in private possession for half a century or more and that people are selling at estate sales? And I can see heads shaking already. So the answer is
Yes. The estate sale, I mean, we discover all kinds of things in estate sales. And just because the demand for that item was purchased, 100 years ago, 15 years ago, 50 years ago, it doesn't matter. Anytime that item is bought and sold, it creates value, which drives a market. So if somebody sees in that market that tiger hide brought $300, they're going to seek another tiger hide. So even in historical estate sale type auctions or sales, it's still driving a market. And as Ed said, I know we know here in California, that's our primary goal, is to address the market of illegal trade. That's where we in California can contribute internationally.
Yeah, 100%. It's we always treated those really seriously because it does create a market, especially with social media these days. Just having an ad up online for a tiger pelt, I mean, tens of thousands of people can see that in hours. And if even just 10% of those people decide they want a tiger pelt, now we have a problem. So the exception for the federal rule is that under the Endangered Species Act, if it's more than 100 years old, the ESA, Endangered Species Act, doesn't apply. So we kind of lose federal jurisdiction when it's more than 100 years old, but it probably is still a violation of state law, even if it's that old. So, yeah.
so I'll do maybe one or two more. And one of them is there asset forfeiture in wildlife enforcement? And I'm going to see heads going like this again. So we've
Yes.
seen everything, boats, cars. I don't know.
Yes. So one of those questions,
Go ahead.
one of the questions you asked about was the arrest. Do we arrest people? That was an earlier question that Ed kind of spoke about. We do absolutely make arrests. There are certainly challenges within the state of California and internationally with decriminalization, a lot of things going into diversion, which create lower penalties for enforcement. One thing I know the federal partners as well as California, we really focus heavily on civil forfeitures as well. So a lot of these cases, a person might face $40,000 or $50,000 in fine for the illegal importation and sales of, say, sea cucumbers. But you discover in that investigation that they've dealt in $3 million worth of sales of sea cucumbers. Suddenly, your civil strength is far superior to your criminal strength. And we certainly pursue the civil methods. But asset forfeiture is very much part of the criminal trade, just as if it was a truck full of methamphetamine, we treat it the same way if it's a truck full of abalone. And we'll seize the truck and it will become forfeited to the state of California through criminal and civil processes.
So one person already found some 3 goshawk nestlings for sale in New York. So they have given us a website. And there may be some questions that I've missed, but I think that's the majority of them. I think Ed and Nate, and certainly I would say that this was a great career. I mean, really, it's a career that matters. I mean, it was amazing. Um, Most wildlife officers and I suspect fish and wildlife agents, sometimes it's hard to go home at the end of the day because you just want to keep working. We're so passionate about it. So I want to thank everybody for listening tonight. Um, like I said, we can't do this by ourselves. We need everybody's help. Call the tip lines, take good notes, help us out. I did see one question about, what's happening politically, and I can say that right now, that I know that there are budget cuts coming to California Fish and Wildlife, and there's a chance that they're going to lose law enforcement positions. And it would be something, if everybody could say, hey, these are really important positions in California. The same thing with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are big cuts coming to the Department of Interior. So, yes, there are things that you can do. Be active. Tell people what you care about. And most everybody on this cares about wildlife and wild places. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Check out Ed's podcast. Support California Fish and Wildlife officers when you can. And thanks again, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks. It's great being here.